Hi friends, in today's video we're going to talk about pet collars. It almost falls in its own genre all by itself just because we're talking about small metal objects that usually have tiny lettering imprinted on them. There's definitely a challenge involved in painting tiny little pet tags on a pet portrait, depending on how big the portrait is, of course. So for today's video, I thought I'd talk through my process for painting these adorable little name tags on this cute little Frenchie dog named Tucker. And I want to show you guys how I did the hardware, especially because there's some shiny textures involved and fine lettering. I'll give you some tips and tricks for how I did that. Let's jump in. A little bit about this painting, first of all. This is on a Trekell Pet Portrait Competition panel. It's just a wood birch panel that has been finished with several coats of watercolor ground, which makes it ready for painting with watercolor. The Pet Portrait Competition panels by Trekell are so much fun to paint on. They resemble aqua boards. They're wonderful hard surfaces with a little bit of absorbency, and you can see that they handle the watercolor really well. Now, before approaching the collar, of course, you'll want to have a really good sketch. So you can see I've already sketched on all the pertinent details like shadow shapes and dimensions and even the placement of the letters on the little bone tag. And I started out with a really light gray wash all over the collar. But right away, I'm going in and starting to redefine my darkest shapes with black. And for black, I use a mixture of indigo and burnt sienna. So you can see here that I'm using a little bit of a cross-hatching technique for some of that texture of the fabric on the collar itself. And I'm just carefully outlining everywhere where I want to have a little bit more detail. Really, when it comes down to it, anything like a collar or anything else, it's just all about identifying light and shadow shapes. And so this is no different. I'm just trying to identify where the light shapes are and where the dark shapes are. And the collar itself is a gray collar, so I'm painting it in with a mid-tone gray. Again, it's that combination of indigo and burnt sienna to create a nice neutral gray. And you can adjust your values quite easily by gently dipping in water to remove some of the paint. But for the most part, these are just initial washes on the collar. Any dark marks you put down, those are going to be final marks. So it is important to make sure that your drawing is correct before nailing down those shapes. In the center of the collar here, there's a really shiny metal tag. And so for the initial washes of that, I'm just carefully studying my reference photo for guidance for the coloring. There's a shiny gray area on the top, which I've just painted in. And then I'm filling in the rest of the collar just to kind of create a background for this little metal shape. All of those little highlights that I've avoided with my brush, those are so important to make the collar look shiny. If you do end up accidentally losing some of those, of course, you can paint over them with an opaque white paint. But I love the look of just the white of the paper showing through underneath. Now for the tag itself, it's actually picking up and reflecting the light colored fur of the marking underneath the collar. And so I'm painting that in with some burnt sienna and then washing it out to blend it softly into the gray just above it. And you can see when you step back from the bird's eye view that it really does start to look shiny. At the top of the collar, I'm applying some raw umber that's more of this yellowish tone, giving it this gold shiny look. You can use any number of different warm tones like burnt sienna, raw umber, or transparent brown oxide, anything like that to achieve the look of shiny copper or gold. The most important thing is to have high contrast in areas where you have shine next to dark shadows. That's going to help it look really shiny and beautiful. You can see that the surface here does handle some wet and wet. You can see a softening effect happening when I apply two colors wet next to each other. And when we stand back, you can see it suddenly looks like a collar. When you're working this tiny and this up close, it can be really abstract and you can go cross-eyed looking at the details. But when you sit back, if you've painted your light and shadow shapes correctly, it will start looking like the real thing. On this little bone-shaped tag, the outside of it is a shiny metal. It's kind of golden colored. And so for this golden effect, I'm using my Holbein Permanent Yellow Orange. You can use any kind of warm yellow you have. Gamboge Nova would work well too. And then you can use more reddish tones anywhere you see darker shadow shapes. Again, it's so important to carve out any highlights and avoid those with your brush. The highlights are really going to make it look shiny. To help it appear even more metallic, I'm using a phthalo blue to offset that reddish tone. This is creating the look of shiny, cool colored tones within the metal, right up next to the warm tones. And then to really help it pop and look 3D, those dark colors are going to be your best friends. You can come back in once that area is dry with a really dark wash of color on your brush. I'm using a mixture of indigo and a little bit of burnt sienna, again, kind of alternating the ratios of those depending on how warm or cool I want the colors to be. Painting very carefully around the base of the tag where you have that little hole where it attaches to the chain and attaches to the collar. Again, I'm not thinking so much about what it is I'm painting. I'm thinking more about the colors, the shapes, and the values. If you can get the values correct, how light or how dark those shapes are, it will look realistic. This is tiny work though. You're going to need to be able to rest your hand on something for extra stability when you're working this small. And make sure that you are using a brush that's a good tool that can come to a nice tiny point. For brushes, I forgot to mention, I've been alternating back and forth between a tiny liner brush by Arteza. You can see that's the one I'm using here. It's a really nice, springy, tiny, stiff little bristle, and it's working so well for the lettering. To do the lettering itself, you can see I'm outlining the top and the bottom of the dimension of the letters, sort of in a rectangle shape, just outlining that whole shape and then filling in all the dark inside of the bone. And then from there, I have a better idea of how I can go in and fill in all of the individual letters themselves. And you can see I'm just negative painting carefully around the white letter shapes. I am looking back and forth rapidly between my painting and the reference photo, again for guidance on this, and it's okay if they're not exactly perfect. Remember, it's just so tiny, but you do want to be able to read the name. That is important. I'm using brighter colors like burnt sienna and permanent yellow light and some of these other warm tones, again to accentuate the look of metal on this tag right here. And then using a brown color to darken up some of the shadow tones in between the chains. All of this is just serving to tighten up those details, to really make the highlights pop by darkening up the shadows as dark as possible all around the highlights. Contrast really draws the eye in. And if the tag is something that's important to the person who owns this pet, which it often is, make sure that you're doing a good job of helping that tag really stand out and appear to be part of the portrait itself. If you're still fairly new to watercolor and feel a little bit rusty about some of the techniques we're talking about, be sure to download my free 20-page ebook. It's called the Watercolor Jumpstart Guide, and you can find a link for that in the description below. The other French Bulldog next to Tucker, his name is Bear, and I did the same techniques for his name tag. Of course, it's a little bit of a different angle, and it might be a different color here and there. But again, the concepts remain the same. To create effective looking name tags for your pets, make sure that you're adjusting your values and leaving plenty of shiny highlights. The highlights and the shadows are going to be the most important thing to make it look realistic. Really quick, if you are enjoying this video, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It helps me out as a creator to be able to continue bringing you free content like this. I'm using a tiny Arteza brush once again for these little details. These brushes are great. They're so inexpensive, and I find that I reach for them all the time for some of these tiny details. They are so springy and maintain a nice fine point without getting flattened out. So that's something I appreciate about these small synthetic brushes. I'm using the same technique as I used with Tucker for his name tag by painting around the letters in a rectangular shape first and filling in all of the darkest values within the name tag. And then from there, I can go back in and negative paint around the white letters. If you do accidentally cover up your letters, it's totally okay. You can always go back in with a white ink or a white acrylic paint, any white opaque paint to cover up your letters and try it again. And it might be a little bit easier to paint that way. To make it look metallic, be sure to use some really bright colors that are not muddied up by anything else. So make sure that you're using clean paint on your brush when you're laying down these bright yellows and oranges to make it look like wonderful shiny metallic. And then you don't want it to all be warm tones. To make it look like metal, you do have to introduce some more cool tones like this phthalo blue or a nice bluish gray, and that will really help it look shiny and silver. So there we go. There is the condensed version of these two little dogs and their name tags. There are Tucker and Bear. I had so much fun painting these guys. Let me know in the comments what you guys do special for painting hardware and tags on pet portraits. I'd love to hear about it. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.